All right. So we are now starting one of our largest sections being the tribulation. And although today I'm not necessarily diving directly into the tribulation, I do want to, make the mention that we're not looking at church related prophecies anymore. And we're looking at things that are much closer geared towards the tribulation. Specifically today, one of the things I want to cover is the war of Gog and Magog, and how essentially that's unfolding right before us. Um, Before I get into that, I actually wanted to share with you some current events that just occurred this week that I just found very interesting. Just the week of April 4th. So on April the 7th, Israel's government collapses again, mind you. And they're saying it's a prophecy that some Jewish scholars said. I don't care about their prophecies per se. That's not something I believe, but still the heart behind it, I do care, because they say prophesied in the Talmud as a sign of Messiah, our antichrist. You got to remember, you got to switch the words. You gotta think of it from our perspective, not their perspective. Now, to give you a little bit of background, for the past, 5-6 years, since 2018, since I can recall, when I went to Israel, they have been having trouble having a steady government. Let me see. Israel's government collapses again since 2018. No party has been able to form a stable coalition in Israel's government. So although there may be votes that occur, and then the winner, essentially what has to happen is that the winner needs to form a government. Enough people need to be able to form that government. So it's like a two-step process. Since 2018, specifically with Benjamin Netanyahu and several other opponents, it kept on being that Benjamin Netanyahu continued to win, but he wasn't able to form a government. So there was another re-election since 2018. I think again in 2020, 2021, there were so many re-elections that occurred. I think one every year, maybe even two. And so since 2018, what I'm trying to point out is that there's been that instability. Finally, late 2021, right during our election as well. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of 2020. Well, then I lost track of time. But recently, not too long ago, the last election that happened against Benjamin Netanyahu and Naftali Bennett, if I'm not mistaken, finally the opponent won, and finally he was able to form a government. Apparently, it wasn't that strongly knit because he finally stepped down. Just in one of, not Naftali Bennett, but one of the key individuals of that government had stepped down. It's somewhere in the article. I just didn't write it down. It's not too important. What I want to point to though is that again they're still in that time of instability. What the religious Jews are looking forward to is, let me mute my phone. What they're looking forward to is the day when there is no government per se, and that there is a Messiah leading them instead. And so the religious Jews keep on pointing at this instability as in the Messiah is coming soon. Never in, well, it's only technically been about 70 years of Israel's current formation as a nation, but never in these 4 years now, has there been this level of instability. So I find that interesting. Something that's occurring this week unfolding. And also, since we're getting into the tribulation, I want to feel more comfortable sharing these types of things of current events, even though I wasn't really looking at it too much. Another thing, April 5th, the Sun finally received, the news paper place, they received Pentagon documents that they had requested from back in 2017 from a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, about a UFO program, a government program that existed. In those documents, what's interesting to me is that in those documents, they have also unaccounted for pregnancies. Isn't that what happened in Genesis chapter 6? What I've been talking about, what I was theorizing. that there is a linkage. I do not, and I want to be very clear, I do not think that these are off-world aliens. I think that this has its connections in the Bible, specifically fallen angels. The fact that there are accounts of this happening, how many hundreds or thousands or maybe, I don't know, millions across the world have been born from these unaccounted pregnancies? Is this the return of the Nephilim? Is that why Jesus said in Matthew 24, it will be like the days of Noah? I don't think he was speaking of just sin, because we've always lived in sinful times. The days of Noah included that. So let's read here. Pentagon documents by the Sun from the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, is part of a huge freedom of information request. Originally requested in 2017, finally released on April 5th, 2022. So they took a very long time just to release those documents. It is our right to be able to request certain documents, even whether or not they redact it, that's up to them. And yeah, there are some documents that we may request from the government that will be heavily redacted with those black lines. But the government should be responding to our requests. And lo and behold, 3, 4, 5 years later, they finally, give it in several types of documented encounters. Is this the reemergence of the Nephilim? This is some of the documents that you see here. So the documented cases that they have are actually from 1873 till 1994. So are there newer cases? Of course, but to think that this has been going on since the 1800s, and that there's documented cases that the government does not openly speak about. And of these, we have apparent abductions that, again, tying this back to Genesis chapter 6, they took wives for them, whomever they chose. That doesn't really sound too much like a choice. But there's so many different things perceived of time loss. And some of these things I want to bring up again when we look at a prophecy in Daniel chapter 10, which I find interesting. Some of the effects that Daniel had when encountering an angel was that he froze, and even fainted. And you see some similar things happening: voice loss, perceived of time loss, paralysis, things like that. Is that what the tribulation is going to look like if these things, do come down? I think, I know it's still in the realm of speculation, but some of these things may occur during the tribulation. This is just more of a summarized view. Some people get heart palpitations, burnt skin, nightmares, nosebleeds, fevers, hair loss, headaches. I mean, we as Christians know that we can have, demonically inspired nightmares. Not every dream is demonic. Not every dream is also from God. Sometimes dreams can be from the mind. But we are well aware, at least, of this aspect of it. Continuing. Just other things: perceived teleportation, gynecological problems. One of the things you see if you were to study abduction cases, is that apparently these alien UFOs, whatever you want to call them, they seem highly interested in the reproduction system. Isn't this how Nephilim come about? Also, another thing I want to point out is that they give ratings as to what type of, I guess, encounter per se these things fall in. So we're not going to read any actual cases, but they put them into categories. So let's look at some of these categories. This is AN rating: anomalous behavior, which could be anything from lights to unexplained explosions to anomalies which do have lasting physical effects. So the first one being no lasting physical effects, the second type having lasting physical effects. Also, anomalies associated with entities, witness interactions with entities, so something like a near-death experience per se, religious miracles, visions, out-of-body experience. Anomalous reports of injuries or deaths, spontaneous human combustion, never heard of that. Unexplained wounds as permanent healing that results from a paranormal experience. And quickly, that was my first time reading that. Permanent healing that results from a paranormal experience. I do believe that if this hypothesis that I'm guessing, I still want to call it speculation, that if these so-called aliens come down and begin commingling with humans and showing themselves more, I definitely believe that they want to show themselves in a positive light, at least for some time being. And that could include, beneficial technologies, healing, things of that nature. And just right here, what I read was, and unexplained wounds as well as permanent healing that results from a paranormal experience, and saying that they are good, that no, we want to help you also rise to this godlike level, um, and correcting our frequency, our vibrations, and removing these old beliefs that we previously had. Again, removing God from the picture. But continuing, there's more different types of categories. So MA rating describes behavior of a UFO. It is analogous to a nocturnal light, daylight disc, or radar visual HINIC. So a UFO has been observed which travels in a discontinuous trajectory. And this is one of the weird things about UFOs, which prove the point that they are not coming from another government. They may be going like this thousands of miles and then do a right turn and go somewhere else. First off, if a human was in that vehicle, dead, just from the amounts of G-force. But other than that, like, it's not even that we don't even have a vehicle that can replicate such a feat, but that defies our understanding of physics. It completely negates the properties of momentum that we have. If you're going thousands of miles this way, you should not be able to do a 90-degree turn the other way. So this is breaking our current understanding of the laws of physics. Of course, they are technically, to put it this way, they are technically in the realm of working in the laws of physics. They're just apparently at a higher either dimension, a higher understanding that we have not unlocked. Our sciences are trying to explain what God has created and established in our world. And that's, science that is still evolving per se. But I wanted to point that out to you. It's breaking our current understanding of physics. Other types of this MA is, so the same thing plus any physical evidence left by the UFO, or MA3 would be MA1 plus any entities observed on board so that they also see individuals on it. Well, if those individuals are on it with a discontinuous trajectory, how can that be human? Continuing, MA4 maneuvers accompanied by a sense of reality transformation of the observer, and MA5, a maneuver that results in permanent injury or death of a witness. I was reading further into this, and apparently the MA5, these types, because it left a injury on the individual that witnessed it, now when the government, mind you, this is government documentation, because of the injury left on the individual, now in their mind they're like, hey, we can still use that information to reverse engineer that technology. So going back to an idea that you at least see in the book of Enoch, again, still want to be careful and say, this is speculation, but in the book of Enoch you have these angels teaching mankind new technologies. Way back it was how to make weapons and healings of certain types of roots and magic and I don't know, things like that. But now with these things that are occurring that the government is still reverse engineering, so are we in a sense creating alien technology per se by reverse engineering? Are we in a sense what's the word I'm looking for? Almost as in an agreement per se with fallen angels, with essentially demons, to get information. Like, is there an exchange, an agreement per se? And that's kind of the crazy part if you think about it from that way. But just continuing on, there's also FB flyby ratings, different types of flyby ratings where, again, there's physical evidence left on board, entities left on board. But just this last one I do want to focus on, close encounter ratings, which is where you're looking at the individual, not necessarily the object. So UFO comes within 500 feet of witness. CE2 is also a CE1, but that leaves landing traces or injuries to the witness. So it's not a hallucination if there's apparently landing happening. CE3 entities have been observed on the UFO. CE4, the witness has been abducted. This is where we get into the scary things. CE5 is CE4, which with results in permanent psychological injuries or death. So apparently the people that in CE5, the people that experience the CE4, some are left crazy and might even kill themselves. But continuing on, this is also the conference that Fred was talking to me about that I looked up. I was happy to see, which is why Fred referenced it to me, that our top theologians, our top apologetics, our top thinkers in the Christian world are now speaking of this. I'm not entirely sure what exactly they covered. They covered this on Thursday, just this past Thursday, this week, a Christian conversation about extraterrestrial phenomenon. I have no idea what they're speaking about exactly, but I'm happy to see that Christians are beginning to talk about this because I truly believe that this is something that's coming. It may take a few years for it to get from these conferences over to our pulpits so that we can denounce those lies the same way we've denounced any type of lie that tries to come and affront the gospel of God. But I am happy to see that our top Christian thinkers are all, that in a sense we're in agreement. I'm calling this speculation to be, careful with what I'm saying, but the fact is the government is talking about these things, and if the Bible points to these things, it is in relation to fallen angels. Other than that, we can start getting into the topic for today, which is the war of Gog and Magog. Now, I do want to say that this is a subject that I was pretty ignorant about for a long period of time. Specifically, the chapters I want to cover is chapter 38 of Ezekiel and chapter 39 of Ezekiel. And the reason why I say I was ignorant about it, because I'd probably maybe only read it maybe once beforehand. And early on when I was taught about the war of Gog and Magog, without getting into the details, I was like, well, it mentions Gog and Magog also in Revelation chapter what? Chapter 20. Chapter 20, verses 7 through 10, it mentions Gog and Magog. Why is there a debate as to when this war occurs? It's after the tribulation, and I didn't think much of it. In doing so, I was not looking at the details, because if you were to look at the details of both accounts, you come to the conclusion that these are two separate accounts. So I will cover the one in Revelation chapter 20 eventually, once we get to the end of the tribulation, once we speak on the millennial kingdom. But that is one that specifically occurs during the millennial kingdom, at the end specifically of the millennial kingdom, that final war. So also, why is it given the same name? Now, this is not a country that will become the name of Gog or Magog, and I do want to clarify, and I always get them mixed up. I believe Magog is the leader of the country, and Gog is the country. But there is no country that will turn into the word Gog and Magog. What the Bible does to not have any confusions on current borders is that it speaks on the original country, per se. So if you look at the 70 nations that occurred after Noah got off the boat and they dispersed, I'm not going to flip over to that chapter because I didn't write it down. But speaking of that context of time, after the Tower of Babel, so somewhere after Genesis chapter 11, you see that Gog went up north. So when the Bible references Gog and Magog, it's not talking about our current borders. Our Bible is never going to say Russia per se, because this is what it's in reference to. It's always speaking of the original names, and it's to avoid those confusions because borders change all the time. Another thing I want to point out to you, which will become important in maybe a few more minutes and a few more slides, is that I find it interesting to think about it this way. In Hebrew text, which is the book of Ezekiel, obviously we have this also in our Bibles, but in Hebrew text you have a mention of the war of Gog and Magog. In Christian text, to also put it that way, which is the book of Revelation, that is Christian text per se, you have the mention of Gog and Magog. And also in Muslim texts, you have a mention of Gog and Magog. Those are three Abrahamic faiths, and they all have a mention of Gog and Magog. For the Muslims, they call it Juj and Majuj. I was curious, again, not that I believe their prophecy, but I was curious as to what it says about it. It's not like I read it myself. I had YouTubed some videos, and I wanted to hear a Muslim's perspective on Juj and Majuj, Gog and Magog. And there is one little aspect of it that may infringe on what's going on here, and so I'll make that connection in a few moments, but I just found it interesting that there's a mention in each. What I'm really debating though is whether or not we read the whole thing, because it is two pretty long chapters. Have you guys ever read Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39? Let me go ahead and read it. I'll try to fly through it. So it's in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. If you want, open up to your own Bibles too. It's kind of long chapters. Let me actually get a cup of water really quick because I'm already dying here. And we're probably not going to have a break. I think the whole session is going to be on just Gog and Magog. Okay, so Ezekiel chapter 38. I'll try to fly through it. So this is a message that came to me from the Lord. Son of man, turn and face Gog, the land of Magog, the prince who rules over the nations of Meshech, Tubal, and prophesy against him. Give him this message from the sovereign Lord. Gog, I am your enemy. I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaws to lead you out with your whole army, your horses and chariots in full armor, and a great horde armed with shields and swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya will join you too with all their weapons. Gomer and its armies will also join you, along with the armies of Beth Torgama from the distant north and many others. Get ready, be prepared, keep all the armies around you mobilized, and take command of them. A long time from now, you will be called into action. In the distant future, you will swoop down on the land of Israel, which will be enjoying peace after recovering from war and after its people have returned from many lands to the mountains of Israel. That's important. When did they return to the land of Israel? Some 70 years, 1948, some roughly 70 years ago. Verse 9, you and your allies, a vast and awesome army will roll down on them like a storm and cover the land like a cloud. This is what the sovereign Lord says. At that time, evil thoughts will come to your mind, and you will devise a wicked scheme. You will say, Israel is an unprotected land filled with unwalled villages. During that time, it was weird to see unwalled villages. Typically, villages, castles, all that stuff. Moving on. I will march against her and destroy these people who live in such confidence. I will go to these formerly desolate cities that are now filled with people who have returned from exile in many nations. I will capture vast amounts of plunder. I want you to remember that mention right there. I will capture vast amounts of plunder. There's certain mentions of treasure and things like that, which might become important in the future. For people are now rich with livestock and other possessions now. They think the whole world revolves around them. But Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish will ask, do you really think the armies you have gathered can rob them of silver and gold? Another mention. Do you think you can drive away their livestock and seize their good and carry off plunder? Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy against Gog. Give him this message from the sovereign Lord. When my people are living in peace in their land, you will then rouse yourself. You will come from your homeland in the distant north and your vast cavalry and your mighty army, and you will attack my people Israel, covering their land like a cloud. At that time in the distant future, I will bring you against my land as everyone watches, and my holiness will be displayed by what happens to you, Gog. Then all nations will know that I am the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord asks. Are you the one I was talking about long ago when I announced through Israel's prophets that in the future I will bring you against my people? But this is what the sovereign Lord says. When Gog invades the land of Israel, my fury will boil over. In my jealousy and blazing anger, I promise a mighty shaking in the land of Israel on that day. All living things in the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the animals in the field, small animals that scurry along the ground, and all the people on the earth will quake in terror at my presence. Mountains will be thrown down, cliffs will crumble, walls will fall to the earth. I will summon the sword against you and all the hills of Israel, says the sovereign Lord. Your men will turn their swords against each other. I will punish you and your armies with disease and bloodshed. I will send torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and burning sulfur. In this way I will show my greatness and holiness, and I will make myself known to all the nations of the world. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Chapter 39. Son of man, prophesy against Gog. Give him this message from the sovereign Lord. From the sovereign Lord, I am your enemy, O Gog, ruler of the nation of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around and drive you towards the mountains of Israel, bringing you from the distant north. I will knock the bow from your left hand and the arrows from your right hand. I will leave you helpless. You and your armies and your allies will all die on the mountains. This is the curse. That this is essentially how the war is going to end. You and your armies and your allies will all die on the mountains. I will feed you to the vultures and wild animals. You will fall in the open fields, for I have spoken, says the sovereign Lord. And I will rain down fire on Magog and on all your allies who live safely on the coasts. Then they will know that I am the Lord. In this way, I will make known my holy name among the people of Israel. That's also important. That verse right there, verse 7. In this way, I will make known my holy name among the people of Israel, my people of Israel. I will not let anyone bring shame to it, and the nations too will know that I am the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. The day of judgment will come, says the sovereign Lord. Everything will happen just as I have declared it. Then the people in the towns of Israel will go out and pick up your small and large shields, bows, arrows, javelins, and spears, and they will use them for fuel. There will be enough to last them 7 years. That's also another key verse, that their weapons will last them for 7 years for fuel. Verse 10. They won't need to cut wood from the fields or forests, for these weapons will give them all fuel they need. They will plunder those who planned to plunder them, and they will rob those who planned to rob them, says the sovereign Lord. And I will make a vast graveyard for Gog and his hordes in the valley of the travelers, east of the Dead Sea. I will block those who travel there, and they will change the name of that place to the valley of Gog's hordes. It will take 7 months for the people of Israel to bury the bodies, another key verse, and cleanse the land. 7 months just to bury and cleanse the land. Everyone in Israel will help, and it will be a glorious victory for Israel when I demonstrate my glory on that day, says the sovereign Lord. Another key verse, verse 14. After 7 months, teams of men will be appointed to search the land for skeletons to bury, so that the land will be made clean again. Whenever bones are found, a marker will be set up on the burial crews. Will take them to be buried up on the valley, in the valley of Gog's hordes. There will be a town named Hamana, which means horde. And so the land will finally be cleansed. Verse 17. And now, Son of Man, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Call all the birds and the wild animals and say to them, gather together for my great sacrificial feast. Come from far and near to the mountains of Israel, and there eat the flesh and drink the blood. Eat the flesh of mighty men and drink the blood of princes. And though as though they were rams, lambs, goats, and bulls, all fattened animals from Bashan. Gorge yourselves with flesh until you are glutted, drink blood until you are drunk. This is my sacrificial feast I have prepared for you. Feast at my banquet table. Feast on horses and charioteers, on mighty men and all kinds of valiant warriors, says the sovereign Lord. In this way I will demonstrate my glory to the nations. Everyone will see the punishment I have inflicted on them and the power of my fist when I strike. And from that time on, the people of Israel will know that I am the Lord, their God. The nations will know why Israel was sent away to exile. It was punishment for their sin, for they were unfaithful to God. Therefore, that's another key verse, that after that war, it's going to be apparently apparent to them, and they may want to repent from their sins and seek God. But it is not the end of I don't think this is the end of the tribulation. But just continuing on. I will turn away from them and let their enemies let me read that again, verse 23. The nations will know why Israel was sent away to exile. It was punishment for their sin, for they were unfaithful to their God. Therefore, I turned away from them and let their enemies destroy them. Oh, speaking of the past, verse 24, I turned my face away and punished them because of their defilement and their sins. And we know that being because they rejected Christ, that they eventually, were scattered among the nations. The last section is already looking actually past the tribulation. It's very different, the language here. Here I definitely would want to apply the double reference rule, where we had spoken about that several weeks ago on the keys of prophecy, where even within the same chapter, even within the same verse, there may be a large gap of time. And I definitely think beginning in verse 25, there is a large gap of time, speaking of 7 years past the tribulation. Now Christ is here and reigning as king, and they have repented, per se, because look at the language now. Verse 25. So now this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will end the captivity of my people. I have mercy on all of Israel, for I jealously guard my holy reputation. They will accept responsibility for their past shame and unfaithfulness after they come home to live in peace in their own land, with no one to bother them. When I bring them home from the lands of their enemies, I will display my holiness among them for all the nations to see. Then my people will know that I am the Lord their God, because I sent them away to exile and brought them home again. I will never leave none of my people behind. I will leave none of my people behind, and I will never again turn my face from them. For I will pour out my spirit upon the people of Israel. I, the sovereign Lord, have spoken. And we know that that's not currently happening right now. His spirit is not upon them. They are far from God, in to put it in another way. So that is what is typically rendered as the war of Gog and Magog. Although you can't capture too much, it's good that we read it, that we sat down to read it, just so that we're aware of what that kind of sounds like. But the details, the clues, the interesting things are found in those clues. There's a few key things that I would want to point out about that war of Gog and Magog. Is, well, when does it occur? Has it occurred in the past, essentially? Who are these nations? Because none of those names seemed familiar to us. Maybe there were some names that it did render in our current countries, but technically in the Hebrew it was not rendered like that. What weapons are at stake? Just certain key things like that, and how they're destroyed. Just looking at those little aspects right there, it begins to show you a little bit more of that situation and something that is currently unfolding. So the first thing I want to look at is the context clues of these chapters. So Ezekiel chapter 38 through 39 speaks of a war with various countries attacking Israel. I also want to point out that there are Christians that make the incorrect assumption, believing that this is the war of Armageddon, the final war. This cannot be the final war because, again, being very um, highly sensitive to the words that the Bible uses. In the war of Gog and Magog, it is all the nations of the world that come to attack Israel. That is not the language that was used here. It is this country, that country, that country, and that country. Like maybe like 5, 6 countries. I'll list them out in just a moment. But there's a key difference between all countries and a handful of countries. So you cannot say that this is the end of the tribulation. It's two separate accounts. Given the details in Ezekiel chapter 38 through 39, we can confirm that this war has never occurred in Israel's prior history. So we have no record of this occurring. There are actually, just a small tidbit, so actually a lot of Hebrew scholars, Jewish scholars, did not really pay too much attention to Ezekiel chapter 39, 38, and 39 for several hundred years. Christian theologians, they were very cognizant of this, and they would say that this is important, and this is important in relation to the end times. It's only truly been roughly, in the past 50 years that the Jewish scholars have now put in more importance on what's going on here, because they are now aware, this was never fulfilled, and it appears that this may be fulfilled very soon, and that they believe. So we're kind of in agreement in one sense. We believe that this will occur before the tribulation, before before Christ comes down. I'll put it that way. Jewish scholars now believe that this war will occur before their Messiah, in our words, the antichrist, comes. But technically, you can still say it will occur before the Messiah comes. It will occur before Jesus' second coming. So in a sense, they're also right, except that they're going to have a detour of worshiping a false prophet. But that's interesting to note there, that we're kind of in agreement there now. And that's thankfully due to our Christian scholars, that they make fun of how we interpret scripture, yet they paid attention to a prophecy that they were not paying attention to. Moving on. And from that time on, the people of Israel will know that I am their Lord. This is one of the verses that I said is key, because from that time on is a definitive statement of that they will never depart from me again. So you can't say that this particular verse, that there's a gap there that I was pointing out to you. You can't say that that this particular verse will occur before the tribulation or during the tribulation. Well, I guess, before the tribulation, because during the tribulation, they again accept a false god. So if he is their people from that time on, then it contradicts that, if you see what I'm talking about. Because of this verse, it needs to occur before the millennial kingdom, to put it more simply. Because after the tribulation, that's it. Israel never departs from God again, at least not scripturally. It's not there. And well, of course, based on these words. So again, speaking of the context clues, this is our first context clue. This war needs to occur before the millennial kingdom. So right there, I just refuted my previous belief of thinking that Revelation chapter 20 and Ezekiel 38, 39 are the same occurrence. They can't be. The one in Revelation 20 is specifically in the millennial kingdom. So just based off of this, we know that these are two separate occurrences. Let's look at another little bit of a context clue. So also in Ezekiel chapter 39, verses 9 through 10, because the weapons are used as fuel for 7 years, it must occur at the very latest in the early tribulation. So again, I'm trying to place this somewhere on a timeline. I keep on moving that a little bit now to the left. It's before the tribulation, thinking of that timeline. I'm sorry, it's before the millennial kingdom, thinking of that timeline. But it also has to at least occur before the tribulation, because why if this were to occur in the mid-tribulation or at the end of the tribulation, why does Israel need fuel for 7 years when Christ is reigning as king on earth? That's a counter argument. So thinking of this occurrence of needing the fuel for 7 years from that war, it would at the very latest have to occur in the early tribulation. So again, we keep on moving that dial a little bit more. Continuing, but because Israel is to experience peace in the land for the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, it must occur before the tribulation, because we know that the tribulation begins, according to Daniel chapter 9 verse 27, with a covenant, with a peace treaty. The first horseman in Revelation chapter 6 being the antichrist, he comes with peace. That is how the tribulation starts, with peace. So again, the war of Gog and Magog can also happen at the beginning of the tribulation. So let's move that slider again a little bit more, and this war needs to occur before the tribulation. What is before the tribulation? Right now, we are before the tribulation. So it can technically occur now up until the tribulation. How far along is the tribulation? And I kind of want to jog your memory a little bit with the things that we were talking about. There were 3 classes. I think these were 3 separate classes. One speaking of when will Jesus return, that we looked at the previous church history that occurred in the past. When we looked at that, we looked at also prophecies of when can Jesus return. What prophecies are left to be fulfilled before Jesus can come back? We saw from previous church history, it was very hard for him to come during the 1500s, during the 1000 AD, all that stuff, because the church was not ready. What we ended up seeing is that now there's technically nothing holding us back. So again, thinking of when can Jesus return, if we had a clock per se, a time range per se, we can begin shortening our hands as to roughly when that range is. The second thing I was talking about is the birth pains. If you remember the birth pains, I roughly came to the conclusion that in the past 20 years, we've been living in the birth pains. The frequency and intensity of the birth pains that we've been living in has continued to increase in frequency and in intensity. With that being said, we've been living in roughly 20 years of birth pains, and how bad they've been getting. Do you see another 20 years? Thinking of a time range, is it this much time before Christ comes, or more like this much time? The last thing that I covered was the one that I recorded in my house, looking at prophecy from a different perspective of Genesis chapter 6, Genesis chapter 11, looking at the transhumanistic things, whether it's from UFOs or even mRNA, CRISPR technologies changing our DNA, things like that, with the advancements that we have with AI, with computer technology, things like that. Again, and we see how far those technologies are along. Most of them are within 20 years. So asking that question, looking at those 3 classes, how far along are we before we get to the tribulation? Based on the hypothesizing, based on these 3 classes, I truly feel like it's within 20 years. I find it hard for another 20 years to go by without anything else happening, especially when you're speaking of the birth pains. Speaking of the birth pains, a woman does not begin getting contractions, 10-minute, 5-minute, 3-minute, 2-minute, 1-minute contractions, and then let's go back home. I'm not going to give birth today. If you're having contractions, it's going to continue to get worse. And that's the idea. I don't think things are going to get better. So with that in mind, with where we are now, and it needs to occur before the tribulation, shouldn't this war be happening anytime soon? Are we already in the midst of the beginnings of the war of this occurring, with what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, and NATO? And that's what we're going to keep on looking at. Also, because God is dealing with Israel, again, as stated in Ezekiel chapter 29, verse 22. I'm sorry, I probably meant 39. Many theologians believe that the church will not be present on earth. Yeah, I definitely meant chapter 39. So theologians believe that God deals with either the church or Israel one at a time. Right now, he is dealing with the church because Israel denied Christ. So we've been in this church age. Speaking of the war of Gog and Magog, fast forwarding to Ezekiel chapter 39, verse 22, which is this same verse that I put, and from that time on, my people of Israel will know that I am their Lord. This could be hinting at the fact that God is no longer dealing with the church, i.e., the church is raptured off away from the earth, and now he begins dealing with Israel again. So before I finish my thought, let me just keep on reading. For these combined reasons, many theologians believe the conclusion of the war of Gog and Magog will occur after the rapture, but before the tribulation. And that's really where I want to finally put that slider. The war can technically begin today, this war of Gog and Magog, but for it to conclude somewhere in the midst, I truly believe that the rapture would occur somewhere in the midst of that war. Because finally, when you're concluding that war, it seems that God is already directly dealing with Israel. According to this logic, you can push the rapture to its limits. The rapture of the church would technically have to occur before Ezekiel chapter 39, verse 22. So that gives you more or less, some context clues as to where to put that in a timeline setting per se. Now, let's speak of the key players. Who are the key players of this war? So without doing a lot of this research, I had to honestly rely on other theologians and the research they've done, because this is not really my strong suit. But all these names have a meaning and it's researchable as to what these countries are. So the land of Magog is an encapsulating term which includes Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. So what's Rosh? Rosh, in other words, is Russia. I'll point that out to you. Meshach, we'll see a map in a second. Meshach is Moscow, the western side of Russia. So Russia is very large. Rosh is roughly in the center of where Russia is at. Meshach is more western, the European side of Russia, while Tubal is the Eastern Asian side of Russia. And Gog being the prince of Magog, today, in today's terms, that would be Putin. That can change if he were to be a different president. That's interchangeable. At the end of the day, it's the prince of Gog that God was speaking to as of today, and I don't think he's leaving anytime soon. More than likely, again, if we're speaking of in the next 20 years, all these things occurring, it is more than likely that Putin will be the individual that fulfills this prophecy. Allies, it mentions Persia, which in today's terms is Iraq, Cush, which is Ethiopia, Put, which is Libya, Gomer, which is, and this one's a little hard to define because there's so many European countries in a short area, again, because of today's borders. But Gomer is as west as Germany and as east as Ukraine. And I'll show that to you right now in a map. And Togomer is Turkey. So there's things where it's not highly disputed and some other ones that are highly disputed. But again, here we got Rosh, Meshach, Tubal. They all encompass the same idea. Russia's this huge piece of land. You got Gomer, which is as west as Germany, as east as Ukraine. So, it's somewhere in this area. What country exactly is going to fulfill it? I don't know. I'm not 100% sure. But we have Togomer, which is Turkey, Persia, which is Iran, Cush, which is south of Egypt, but not today's Egypt, south of the empire of Egypt. So keep that in mind. So yeah, that's somewhere around here. And also Put, which is today's Libya, is westward of the ancient empire of Egypt. So the idea, before I continue, the idea is that all these countries gathered together to war against Israel. Now, this is where I get a little bit into that what was being spoken about for the mention that's in the Quran. So the Quran, to speak a little bit about what it says on Juj and Majuj. Again, I don't care per se like exactly what is there, but I definitely want to get what their mentality is, because Some of these Muslim nations, and Northern Africa is heavily Muslim as well. Their Muslim beliefs will also affect this war of Gog and Magog because they also have it. According to the Quran, Juj and Majuj, Gog and Magog, when that war happens, it'll be at a time when, what's this river? The Euphrates River begins to lower in water, that it will be discovered that there is gold, and again, this is Quran text, that there will be a mountain of gold essentially, and every man will believe that 99 out of 100 men will die trying to get that gold because of the war that occurs at that time. Yet every man will believe that I will be that one of that 99 out of 100. I will be that one that doesn't die. So that's kind of the warning it gives those individuals, which is why I said pay attention to the mentions of the gold and the silver and things like that, because I think the Old Testament scripture was also kind of hinting at some of that stuff, except it was speaking on it from Israel's behalf, that they're trying to get your gold. Meanwhile, for Juj and Majuj, that they're trying to take the gold that was not theirs per se. So this is great spoil, and the reason why I kind of mentioned this as speculation is because I did look at a little bit of a text that we do not consider holy, and also because I've never really heard of a theologian bring this up in reference to the war of Gog and Magog. But let me go ahead and show you that verse in Ezekiel chapter 38. So Thus says the Lord God, it will come about in that day that thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil plan, and you will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go to those who are at rest and live securely, all of them living without walls and having no bars or gates, to capture spoil, to seize plunder. Going back to that belief that they have, that when the Euphrates River begins to lower in water, a mountain of gold will be found. To turn your hand against the waste places which are now inhabited, and against the people who are gathered from the nations, who have acquired cattle and good, who live at the center of the world, Sheba and Dedan. I actually didn't list these countries, but this is more than likely North and South Saudi Arabia, and the merchants of Tarshish, which is the merchants of Tarshish is probably speaking of Great Britain, that area, with all of its villages, will say to you, have you come to capture spoil? And mind you, it's not saying that they will be a part of the war, but that they look at those countries and like, do you guys think you're going to survive, kind of thing. Have you come to capture spoil? Have you assembled your company to seize plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods and capture great spoil? And that is the idea that occurs in the accounts of Juj and Majuj, that there is a lot of gold and great spoil. Muslims have a belief that when the Euphrates River dries, a mountain of gold will appear. Many nations will go to war for that gold. The Quran warns them not to go near it. That 99 out of 100 men that go to try to get that gold will die in battle. But each of those men will say to themselves, this is in the Quran, that each of those men will tell themselves, no, but I will be that one that survives. and they're actually warned not to go. Simultaneously, we see another mountain of gold was found in the Congo recently. Are these events all related to the war of Gog and Magog scenario brewing? So what's good is that as we get closer to these tribulation topics, as I was previously mentioning, that we get to see a lot more current events because we're truly at the door. Like Jesus is right at the door of how close our salvation is. So speaking of that, what do we see? This is, I didn't put the date of this article, but this is recent news, roughly like in the past 2 years, I believe. Iraq's mighty rivers Tigris and Euphrates will soon run dry. That's prophecy also in our Bibles, not just the Quran. I just mentioned it because of the fact of the gold, which is also mentioned in the book of Ezekiel. Iraq's two main rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, will run completely dry within 2 decades. again, within 20 years, also roughly the same time that I'm kind of saying of when these things will occur. A report by the country's water ministry has warned the two rivers which originate in Turkey and run through Syria are some source of up to 98% of the Iraq's surface water supply. What else do we see? So Turkey, where the river runs, Turkey in the past few years, in December 24th, 2020 and June 10, 2021, they have found gold deposits. 3.5 million ounces worth $6 billion of gold deposits they have found. Another one, gold worth $6 billion. These are two separate accounts, two separate I'm sorry, these two are the same, but this one is different. 20-ton gold reserve worth 1.2 billion, and the other one that is worth 6 billion. Two separate deposits that they're finding simultaneously with this occurring. Ezekiel speaks of there being great spoils somewhere. Either Israel is getting some of the spoils and now these countries are coming to go and take it, or there are spoils also found in Israel, or the other option is that this is just a signs of the times that there are spoils happening, and also within that time frame they also decide to go to war with Israel. So it could be one of those three. So either Israel took some and now they're trying to get it back, or the gold is in Israel, like found in Israel, and countries want to war it, or it's just a sign of the time that this is happening somewhere else, but they just want to go to war with Israel, fulfilling Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. More news. So this one isn't in the Euphrates River, but there is also another mountain of gold found in the Congo, which is by Libya. By Libya, which is put west of Egypt. So it was part of that map. So is that related to? I'm throwing some things out. I'm not sure if it's fully related, but and if you see video of this, like people are. This is a clean look. This is it's ridiculous the amount of people going to that mountain, and they're literally they're not mining it. These are village people that are just picking it up, and it's literally like a mountain of gold. But is this also what was prophesied? A gold mountain. The gold mountain distance is 4,774 kilometers from the Euphrates River. So this is, I believe, a Muslim publication that, again, similar to the idea. Yes, the Euphrates River is drying, but the mountain of gold is found somewhere else. So that in this article, they were kind of saying it's just a sign of the time. The fact that the drying of the Euphrates River is occurring, it's a sign of the time. But the mountain of gold that was prophesied is actually that far away, over by the Congo. But continuing on. Oh, I thought I had more. Well, I will bring up more articles. As I was mentioning before, Gog and Magog is not Armageddon. The battle of Gog and Magog must not be confused with the battle of Armageddon. Gog and Magog has certain countries gathering against Israel, but Armageddon has all nations gathered against Israel. So this is the verse from Revelation, just so that you have some context as to what that looks like. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. For they are spirits of demons performing signs, which go out to the kings of the whole world and gather them together for the war of that great day of God, the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief, God says. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked, and men will not see his shame. And they gathered them together in the place which in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Now, these are some of the current events that are brewing. Mind you, I did this PowerPoint a few months before the whole Ukrainian invasion. Again, but these classes are just going to sound more and more like current events per se. But that's just the world that we're living in. And before I even get into this, I definitely want to challenge certain Christians. Dependent on your pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, or post-tribulation view. how much of a conviction is what you have really in in your heart? Like what I would tell to my mid-tribulation or post-tribulation friends is, if you truly believe we're going to go through the tribulation today, how have you prepared for this tribulation that is coming? Are you stocked up on food? Are you growing your own vegetables? Or do you have water filters? Like, have you read the judgments that occur in the book of Revelation? And are you prepared to experience some of those things? Are you stocked up in a sense? Even though I lean towards a pre-tribulation rapture, that's something I'm still cognizant about. Am I prepared if I do have to go through something like that? But these coming classes, I definitely want to, leave that impression upon people as well. But looking at current events that have been brewing up, and this war that is occurring, I do want to be clear. This war that is currently occurring between Russia and Ukraine is not the war of Gog and Magog. Even if the United States were to join in and things like that, that does not make it the war of Gog and Magog. So when does it become the war of Gog and Magog? When they go against Israel. Exactly, when they go against Israel. Even then, being a little bit of devil's advocate, it'll only be the war of Gog and Magog when the prophecy is fulfilled, per se. And even we see hints of nuclear weapons being involved. So even if there's war but there's no nuclear weapons and things like that, like there's several things that go with it. But just continuing. So looking at what's just occurred in these past few months, past year roughly, this is December 8th of 2020. Russia calls Israel the problem in the Middle East and defends its allies, Iran, and defends Iran and its allies. You have to remember, and this is the focus that I want to give you guys. So Russia and the United States don't like each other, but now, so those are two superpowers per se. Who is the United States allies? Israel, okay. And sure, there's some other European countries, but one of the closest ties that the United States has being with Israel. Well, Russia, who are its allies? A lot of these Muslim nations, like Iran, like Turkey, and so on, that do not like Israel. So this is kind of where my mind is going, assuming that the current war between Russia and Ukraine leads to the war of Gog and Magog. This is how I see it playing out in my mind. If it continues between Russia and Ukraine, mind you, United States is getting heavily involved with money, with soldiers, with so on. Little by little, that might lead to war. Already talks of using, in their words, small nuclear weapons. If you use a small nuclear weapon, Russia's going to respond with a bigger nuclear weapon, and it'll just be a game of just, we're getting into nuclear war. There is no such thing. We should never entertain that idea of a small nuclear weapon. I can't believe I even read that article. But okay, so now we have two superpowers essentially warring against each other, the United States and Russia. Well, if Israel were to help out the United States, let me actually backtrack a little so that we get to see the map. If Israel were to help out the United States, right now this is essentially turning into a proxy war per se, where the United States is funding Ukraine. In other words, it's using the Ukraine as a backdrop, but really it's the United States funding a lot of this, and even these European countries that's funding a lot of this. Their weapons has been depleted a long time ago. Russia has, the second largest army in the world. Considering their nuclear capabilities, because China's also there in relation to soldiers. But now if Israel begins to help out with the United States, now the Muslim countries who don't like Israel will want to help out their buddy Russia. Now this turns into also a Russia and an Israel and Muslim war also. And here we got Togomar and Persia, which is Iran and the two guys that we see coming up on the news that don't like Israel. So when does it turn into the war of Gog and Magog? So if these guys are helping out Russia and this guy is helping out the United States, when does it turn into the war of Gog and Magog? When these guys now want to start attacking the individual helping the United States, and now Russia turns into this side of the proxy war of also helping fund them and come against them. And then we also have individuals here that also don't like Israel, which we'll see a couple of articles that also do mention them too. But and what's brewing over here in Ukraine can technically lead to this war of Gog and Magog. Will it? It's hard to say. I mean, it can, especially when we're looking at what's occurring in all these times with the nearness of all these things unfolding. But just 2 years ago, Russia already calling, well, less than 2 years ago, like a year and a half ago, roughly, Russia calling Israel the problem in the Middle East, siding with its enemies. Continuing, May 12, 2021, UN warns of a full-scale war as Israel-Palestine violence intensifies. The United Nations is warning of the risk of a full-scale war as clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinians continue. Again, another reason why Muslims do not like Israel, because they want to fight and protect for the Palestinians. Turkey's Erdogan tells Putin Israel needs a strong and deterrent lesson. Again, these two are buddies. Togomer being Turkey and Gog being Russia. That they're in agreement that, yeah, we need to calm this down. When was this? May 12, 2021. Just a few months back. Ethiopian warlords sneak into Israel. Is this the beginning of the war of Gog and Magog? This is a Jewish publication. But you had Ethiopian warlords that, mistakenly came in, which is what they told the Israeli government. But Israel was leaning more towards the side of, no, they're trying to bring in spies to see, what's going on here. And again, Ethiopia, south of Egypt, that was also one of the countries. What's brewing here? What's going on here? When was that? That was November of 2021. That was 3, 4, 5 months ago. 5 months ago. Once again, the United Nations threatens Israel like the most evil country on the earth. And I believe this is, again, related to the Palestinian conflict. This was 4 months ago, December 26, 2021. Iran says war games in Gulf were a warning to Israel. 2 weeks ago was probably, I got this article, I think I made this PowerPoint back in early February. So let's just call this, maybe January, maybe February. But Iran was doing military exercises with certain missiles. So they're doing this military exercise, and then they release this information that Iran says war games in Gulf were a warning to Israel. Why? Because of some of the capabilities that they have. Iran says war games in Gulf were a warning to Israel, Zionist regime, in its missile exercise. And let me explain to you what these missiles were. So they have a missile. So although Israel has an Iron Dome, which is able to shoot down missiles, Iran now has missiles that can pass through the Iron Dome, that can trick that system. So in other words, today, Israel can be bombed by Iran, and Israel will not be able to stop it. So the Zionist Israeli government were under the impression that this is Iran speaking. The Zionist Israeli government were under the impression that they were capable of neutralizing some of our ballistic missiles, but thanks to our spectacular advances, Israel's anti-missile Iron Dome system fails to detect our projectiles. In other words, Israel can be attacked today. And this was in January 7th of 2022. Iran taunts Israel, says its missiles forced Jerusalem to stop airstrike threats amid nuclear talks. That's another thing brewing up. Since Obama's time, we've been having these nuclear deals with Iran. Trump pulled out of it, and guess what? Iran continued to build up their capabilities. This whole time during the Obama era, they were saying, no, we're not interested in that, playing coy with us. No, we just love the science. We love the energy. They, of course, had interests in building nuclear weapons because, and recently, so when Israel's not a saint either. I understand why they were doing that for their own protection, but they were killing some of Iran's top nuclear physicists, destroying some of their equipment, things like that. And they were throwing bombs here and there in roughly the past year. They stopped though because they saw that they have now a missile that can strike back and cannot be stopped. So they're like, oh snap! Now, if I respond and they respond, this will actually be war. Does that mean Israel will never attack them again? Highly doubt it. But the next time that an exchange happens, it's more than likely going to be war now. Continuing, January 10th, 2022, this year, 3 months back, top Iranian general, when we strike at America, it will be with great force. Although that's not Israel, guess who are the closest allies? America and Israel, regardless of president. So although Biden does not back Israel as well as someone like Trump did, and different presidents differ, at the end of the day, there is a bond between the United States and Israel. I do not think, even with as bad as our presidents get at times, I do not think that, at least right now, we will abandon Israel. We may abandon Israel when the rapture happens. Because why do we back Israel? Because there are Christians in this nation that push our politicians to have a good relationship with Israel. Aside from that, our country is full of atheists, full of people that have odd beliefs, occult beliefs, anything like that. There is no religious reason why they would want to care about Israel. Us, because we believe in God, yeah, we care about that and know that we are blessed as a nation because we bless Israel. But when that rapture occurs, probably also the politicians that were pushing for those reasons as well, or also all the individuals that supported certain politicians based on those agendas. So there may be a time, and this will technically occur. There will be a time where America will not back Israel. Speaking of the war of Gog and Magog, it is not America that comes to the rescue. It is God that comes to the rescue. So they're losing one superpower but getting the real superpower per se. Let's keep on looking at more articles. Also, January 11th, 2022. Turkish scholar warns, do not fall for Erdogan's recent gestures towards Jews in Israel. So to give you a little bit of background, Erdogan of Turkey, he was insinuating that he wanted to begin certain peace talks with Israel. And you have Turkish scholars from that country saying, be careful with him. He's lying to you. The Bible tells us in relation to the tribulation that it will be a time of peace with Israel's enemies, but that peace, that those friends, those enemies that turn to peace, that they will turn against that peace as well. And we already see that certain enemies of Israel are already playing that coin, playing that route, and beginning to be coy in a sense of no, let's talk about peace, knowing that they're probably just still want to attack them relatively soon. Also, January 13th, 2022, a lot of news came out that week. Hamas meets with Iran. Hamas being the leader, one of the two key leaders of the Palestinians in Israel. So Hamas meets with Iran, calls on all Muslim and Arab countries to unite in war against Israel. Again, more of this brewing. So even though it may seem like a Russia, Ukraine, United States conflict, because of the insight that we have in Bible prophecy, and even because of what's unfolding here in our news, all these news articles that occurred in the past 2 years, even though this is not being spoken about right now, these emotions still exist, and they will come back up. So just to be aware of that. Now let's speak on another aspect of the war of Gog and Magog, and it's the weapons at stake, and I find that very interesting. So it speaks of it in the terms that existed for Ezekiel at that time, the Jewish words that existed at that time. There is no Jewish, well, maybe now there is, but there was no Hebrew word for nuclear weapon in the Bible. There's a lot of words that don't exist per se. But you can find evidence that these words, these ancient words, the purpose behind them, the meaning behind them, you can still, in a sense, reinterpret them to our current understanding of what these words are. So, beginning with chapter 39, verse 3, I will strike your bow from your left hand and dash down your arrows from your right hand. Weapons change throughout every generation. Understanding the limitations to their vocabulary, the principle of these weapons can still be interpreted. So what is a bow? A bow is a catalyst for a projectile. And what is an arrow? The projectile which strikes the opponent. So I will strike that projectile and strike also the catalyst, and the projectile itself is what God is saying. Now in today's time, what does that mean? What is the catalyst and what is the projectile? We're talking about rocket launchers. We're talking about missile launches. So can we reinterpret that verse to look this way? I will strike your rocket launcher from your left hand and dash down your missiles from your right hand. Is that what was being pointed out? And I believe that we can do this because the Bible also hints in a different place in the book of Jeremiah something similar, where it was speaking of an arrow in a weird way. I'll show it to you now, where it doesn't make sense if you were thinking of the ancient use of that word, but it does make sense now if you reinterpret it this way based on what the bow and what the arrow is as a catalyst and as a projectile per se. Because this same Hebrew word was not only used for bow and arrow, this same Hebrew word was also at times used for javelin, for certain things that you just throw. But moving on, this is the verse in the book of Jeremiah that's very interesting. Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 9, which says, their arrows shall strike as a mighty expert man. None shall return in vain. Not the individual shooting the arrow itself, the projectile, will strike like a mighty expert man, and none shall return in vain. I can't even pronounce that word, but that's Strong 7919. And it's saying that the arrow will be prudent, the arrow will be circumspect, wisely understand, prosper, that the missile, the projectile is able to think and make a choice as to where it's going, and none shall return in vain. That sounds a lot more like a missile guided system. If none shall return in vain, that means that the thought is within the missile. So this verse implies that the arrow itself, it's smart, and what I believe that that's speaking of is guided missiles. So this, I don't believe it's contrived to say that these bows and arrows, we can reinterpret them as rocket launchers and missiles, again, knowing that there's a limitation in the vocabulary. So let's look again at these weapons that were at stake in Ezekiel chapter 39. It says, then those who inhabited the cities of Israel will go out and make fires and weapons and burn them, both shields and bucklers, bows and arrows, war clubs and spears. And for 7 years they will make fires. They will take wood from the field. They will not take wood from the field or gather firewood from the forests, for they will make fires with the weapons, and they will take the spoil of those who despoiled them and seize the plunder of those who plundered them, declares the Lord. On that day I will give Gog a burial ground in Israel, the valley of those who pass by the east of the sea, and it will block off those who would pass by, so that they will bury Gog there with all his horde, and they will call it the valley of Hamon-Gog. For 7 months the house of Israel will be burning them in order to cleanse the land. Even all the people of my land will bury them, and it will be to their renown On the day that I glorify myself, declares the Lord, they will set apart men who will constantly pass through the land, burying those who were passing through, even those left on the surface of the ground, in order to cleanse it. At the end of the 7 months, they will make a search. Those who pass through the land pass through, and anyone who sees a man's bone, and he will set up a marker until the buriers have buried it in the land of Hamon-Gog, and even the name of the city will be Hamona, so they will cleanse the land. So let's break that down in this way. So first off, weapons that produce 7 years of energy. I want to reinterpret what we saw again and put it into the capabilities that we have today. So it was speaking of all these weapons, gathering them and able to make fuel for 7 years. Well, I don't believe that it's speaking of wood per se. So what weapons can produce 7 years worth of energy? Technically, nuclear weapons can be dismantled and turned back into nuclear energy. There's a process of dismantling all of that and getting back the components and using it in a power plant. So can that be the fulfillment of that verse? Are Israel's enemies, mind you, Russia has the largest, larger than the United States. Not saying that it's more powerful, but they have the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. Well, how God will be glorified, will it possibly be that maybe Russia is throwing out a nuclear missile, it lands in Israel, except it doesn't explode? I mean, that could be a possibility, because it's going to shock the world that God is truly with Israel. Everyone's still going to fall back, and the tribulation will still occur. But firsthand, the world will see how the favor of God is with Israel. That you cannot, the enemy has always tried to destroy all Jews. And look at what Hitler did. Yet there's always a remnant that survives. But in this case, it seems like Israel will not be destroyed. Excuse me. The horde will have a separate burial ground. Can that possibly be nuclear contamination, similar to what we see with Chernobyl, where because there was nuclear waste, that they have to have a separate burial ground where no one is allowed to go? Possibly. After 7 months, they will begin burying the bodies. Why after 7 months? Is it possibly because there's too high of a radiation occurring? This is a Geiger counter. That they wait for a period of time before they begin burying these bodies. Everyone will happily volunteer. Now there's two types of people. There are people that volunteer in helping bury, and they have a specific job. And there are those that are continually employed. In other words, an expert or just someone that in the know-how. So there are those that help search and mark. Again, what do you do when you find something that's nuclear contaminated, that has high radiation? You don't pick it up and touch it. You mark it. It's interesting that they will help search and mark it in verse 15. They will mark these bones. And specialists, those who are continually employed in verse 14, will relocate it and bury it. So there are those that leave the marker, but then there are those that are specially employed, specialists, that relocate it and bury it. Will these individuals be these types of specialists in hazmat suits that have the proper protection in order to do these types of things? Possibly. And it will take 7 months to bury them all. And just speaking of that, that's not necessarily nuclear per se. That's just, speaking of how much is occurring, how much of a cleanup has to occur, stated in verse 12. So conclusions. I already showed this part of the final part of chapter 39. You can apply the double reference rule, because it speaks of the Spirit being with Israel and never departing from them. But that would have to occur. That final piece in chapter 39 would have to occur after the tribulation, because we know that Israel will fall again And there may be a religious revival that occurs after the war of Gog and Magog, and they say, oh, God is with us, God is with us, and now the Messiah is coming, except the Messiah that they choose will be the antichrist. Again, them falling into these things again. But after the tribulation, and when Christ comes down, the true Messiah, now they will not depart. Now this part of the verse will be fulfilled. Beginning chapter 40, which is something we'll get into after the tribulation classes, you begin to see details of the millennial kingdom. So it is clear that a gap of time does occur. So aftermath, we know the tribulation will occur after this war. The 7-year tribulation begins with a covenant of peace. So again, after Israel is victorious, thanks to the hand of God, and there's a religious revival, at the same time, you can imagine that a lot of nations will just want to sign a peace treaty. And okay, no more nuclear war. That was devastating. Look at all these buried bodies, all these months to clean up all these bodies and the destruction that occurred. Let's have some peace. That can be also the Messiah, the Antichrist, coming and helping establish those peace treaties. Although we see a little bit of it, of what I showed you with the Abraham Accords, I don't think it'll come to its full fruition until possibly the end of that war of Gog and Magog. So there's still more unfolding. There's definitely war before peace. Daniel chapter 9 mentions that the one who enforces the covenant is the prince who is to come, the Antichrist. And that's something that we will be looking into certain details. It's more than just chapter 9 of Daniel that speaks on this Antichrist and that government. Speculated order of events. So peace ensues after this war, after the war of Gog and Magog, similar to what I was telling you. Then a false Messiah is revealed, who they will call the true Messiah. Mind you, they still can't form a government. So maybe he will lead Israel. Credit is given to the false Messiah instead of God. And that could be where they begin to fall. So at first it may be, yes, thank God, God's favor is on us. But now they begin to replace that instead of here to that individual that is coming and saying that he is the Messiah. So that's where we'll end for today. It was a long prophecy. And moving forward, I think we'll continue to go roughly at this pace where we're tackling much larger prophecies that cover a lot more ground. If it's something short, we'll cover more than one. But if it's as big as this, we'll try to do one at a time every session. Any questions before we conclude? If not, we'll just close to pray. God, we thank you for bringing us your word. We thank you, Lord, for the insight that you give us, Lord. We see these things are occurring. We see these things are unfolding right before our eyes. I pray, Lord, that you keep us safe, that you help us prepare with whatever that means, and also that we just have that proper focus to continue to serve you, to continue to worship you, to continue to thank you for everything you have done and will continue to do in our lives, Lord. We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.